7 guns came for her. Just one woman stood in their way. But she wasn't just any woman. She was Apache. And on her land, no one dies quietly. What happened over the next 7 minutes became a story whispered across deserts, saloons, and soldier camps for generations. This is not a legend. This is what happens when you underestimate the wrong widow. The wind had a different sound that morning. It wasn't the kind of breeze that danced through the cottonwoods or whispered through the sage. This wind dragged itself low across the ground, angry and dry, clawing at the earth like a wounded coyote. It moaned between the red rocks and rattled the wooden beams of Nokoma's porch like a restless spirit looking for a fight. Nokoma sat still on the creaking chair outside her adobe home, eyes fixed on the far ridges. At 68 winters, her skin had taken on the same cracked, sun-baked hue as the land she lived on. Deep lines marked her face, lines not of weakness, but of memory, loss, defiance. In her lap, a thick braid of raven black hair, streaked now with silver, rested like a coiled rope. She was sewing by hand, patching a blanket that had once covered her husband on cold nights under the stars. The needle moved in rhythm, slow and patient. Like everything she did, the wind changed again. She looked up, dust clouds curled in the distance. Hoofbeats. She knew before she could see them. Riders were coming. Her gaze didn't flinch. She had seen too many men come and go in this desert. Most of them thinking they could take what didn't belong to them. Land, water, blood. A thin smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. The land remembered. So did she. Inside the house, everything was in its place. A rusted kettle, a stack of deer hides, a small wooden box with carvings of wolves and stars, her husband's box. He had died 16 years ago. And still, she kept his pipe, his knife, and a lock of his hair tied with red thread. Apache tradition, Apache love. Her land stretched out over 30 acres of sun-bleached dirt and sharp stones, land her husband had died defending. The white men had called it worthless. Then they found copper beneath it. Suddenly, it was worth dying for. But Nokoma was not just surviving. She was waiting. The wind brought voices now. Men's laughter, boot heels slapping dry ground. 7 riders, maybe more. She stood, brushing dust from her faded cotton dress. She moved like a shadow, light but steady, and stepped off the porch, eyes narrowing as the first silhouette broke through the sun haze. A tall man in a black hat, his mustache curling like a snake's tail. Behind him, 6 others, each armed, dirty, mean-looking. Cowboys? No, mercenaries. Nokoma walked to the edge of her fence and placed both hands on the top rail. She said nothing. The man in black grinned. Well, would y'all look at that? He said, the old widow's still breathin'. One of the others chuckled. Another spit tobacco near a cactus. Nokoma didn't blink. The man's voice changed, lower now, sharp like a blade. You've got 24 hours. Old woman, 24. Then this land's ours. He pulled out a piece of folded paper, something official looking with a stamp and a signature. New claim, he said, company rights. You can read, right? She didn't take the paper. Didn't move. Instead, she said softly, you have 7 men. He blinked, amused. Yeah, you countin' for us now? She nodded. 7 men, 7 spirits. The men laughed again, loud and coarse. The wind didn't. Nokoma turned without another word and walked back to the house. Her back straight, her feet quiet on the dust. Behind her, the riders cursed and spat and mocked. She didn't care, because she wasn't afraid. The land had already chosen sides. Night fell hard across the desert, dragging a thick silence behind it. The stars, cold and distant, pierced through a sky as black as spilled ink. Nokoma sat cross-legged inside her one-room home, a single oil lamp flickering beside her. Its flame danced along the clay walls, casting shadows that looked like spirits. On the floor before her was a shallow bowl of ash and sage. She sprinkled cedar into the mix and set it alight with a glowing ember pulled from the hearth. Smoke curled upward, thin and blue, winding toward the low ceiling. She closed her eyes. A whisper left her lips, not in English, not in Spanish, but in the sacred tongue of her ancestors. Tadis nei, ake, hear me, come near. The voice was barely audible, Yet the room felt suddenly full of memory, of weight, of something old and unseen. She was not praying to gods. Nokoma was calling her husband. For 16 years, she had lived alone, but not without him. His knife lay on the mantel. His tracks were in the floor. His breath still lingered in the wind when it blew through the chimney just right. She whispered again, "They're coming to take what you died for. I need your strength." Outside, the desert shifted in its sleep. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped once, then silence again. Nokoma opened her eyes. There would be no more sleep tonight. She stepped out into the night barefoot. The land beneath her feet was cold, but familiar. She moved from tree to tree, shadow to shadow, her fingers brushing against rocks and bark as if greeting old friends. Every corner of this land had been walked, hunted, bled on. She knew where the brush was thinnest, where the jackrabbits made their trails, where the ground dipped just enough to trap a careless boot. She knelt beside a dried-out mesquite tree and began working quickly. Her old fingers deft and sure. From behind a pile of stones, she pulled out bundles of rope, strips of animal hide, and a sack of rusted metal scraps. She hadn't touched them in years, but she remembered every knot, every loop, every placement. These weren't weapons. They were traps. Apache traps. The kind the cavalry never saw coming. By the time the moon reached its peak, Nokoma had set the last snare in place. A crude swinging log, nothing but a thick branch tied high between two trees, rigged to release with the weight of a single step on a buried tripline. She paused there in the darkness, listening. No hoofbeats, no voices, not yet, but she could smell them. The men from the south weren't from this land. They didn't belong to the desert. They didn't know the taste of wind after rain, or the way buzzards circled early when death came close. These were men with boots too clean, eyes too mean, and fingers that reached for things they never earned. Nokoma stood slowly, one hand resting on a stone marked long ago with red paint, her husband's mark. A symbol scratched into the surface that only she knew the meaning of. We are never alone. She looked up at the stars. 7 of them were gathered closely together in the northern sky. 7 lights. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The wind changed again, colder this time, like a breath before a scream. Nokoma walked back toward her house, slow and silent, her bare feet brushing against the earth that had fed her, bled her, held her secrets. She would wait for morning. And they would come, not as strangers, but as mistakes. Dawn crawled up the desert floor like a wounded beast. The sun didn't rise, it bled. Thin streaks of orange and red stretched across the pale horizon, casting long shadows over the scrub and rock. A low hum filled the air, the kind of silence that wasn't truly silence at all, but something watching. Nokoma stood outside her home, wrapped in a thin shawl of animal hide, her eyes fixed on the trail leading in from the south. Her breath was steady, her back straight. She held no weapon, not yet, but the land around her had teeth now. They came with dust behind them, just like before. 7 riders, same sneers, same spit-laced laughter, but this time, they didn't stop at the fence. They didn't offer warnings or threats. They rode in like they owned the place, their horses kicking up red sand as they fanned out around her home. The man in the black hat, Silas Vane, his name, slid off his horse with the smoothness of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He tipped his hat mockingly as he walked toward her. "Well now," he said, drawing the word out like warm syrup. "Ain't you a vision of desert charm this morning?" Nokoma didn't respond. Silas frowned and nodded to one of the men behind him, a lean, twitchy gunhand named Billy Thorne. The boy couldn't have been older than 22, but the madness in his eyes made him look twice that. "Show her we ain't bluffin'," Silas said. Billy grinned, raised his rifle, and fired into the sky. The shot echoed like thunder. Birds scattered. A jackrabbit bolted across the rocks. But Nokoma didn't flinch. She looked at Billy the same way one might look at a rusted nail, small, ugly, and dangerous only to the careless. Silas stepped closer. "Last chance, old woman. You give up the deed, or we take it. Either way. By sunset this land's got a new owner." Still, Nokoma said nothing. She turned and walked inside her house. slow and calm. Billy raised his rifle again. But Silas grabbed the barrel. "Let her go," he said. "She'll break by noon." Billy snorted. "She ain't gonna break. She's gonna snap, like dry bark." They both laughed. That was their first mistake. They set up camp just beyond the edge of Nokoma's property, in a dried-up creek bed choked with thorns and cactus. A thin line of smoke began curling upward as they started a fire, laughing about whiskey and poker and dancing with Apache ghosts. Billy volunteered to scout the area, see if the old bat's hidden gold somewhere. He joked. He headed north, toward the small ridge Nokoma had scouted the night before. He never made it 20 feet past the brush. The trap was simple, an old Apache design her husband had taught her long ago. Billy's foot hit the tripline, snapping the knot with a sharp twang. A second later, the ground beneath him gave way, a shallow pit filled with pointed sticks, hidden beneath dust and grass. He screamed as he fell. The sound cut across the canyon like a whip crack. Silas and the others sprang to their feet. What the hell? They ran, guns drawn. They found Billy at the bottom of the pit, moaning, blood soaking his pants, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't going anywhere. Silas cursed and looked toward the house. Still no movement, no shots fired, just silence. He narrowed his eyes. That wasn't luck. The others murmured. One of them, Ryder, a man with burn scars along his jaw, spat on the ground. "She's playin' us." Silas shook his head. "No, she's hunting us." Back in her home, Nokoma sat quietly beside her husband's box, holding a single eagle feather between her palms. She whispered a word. "First." And outside, the desert swallowed the cries of the wounded boy. Billy's screams had faded into groans. The sun had begun its brutal climb, already turning the sand white and the sky silver blue. The desert offered no shade, no mercy, just silence and eyes. Always the eyes. Somewhere, hidden in the brush, was a woman too old to run and too wise to chase. Silas Vane stood at the edge of the pit, one hand on his belt buckle, the other shading his eyes. "She didn't just get lucky," he muttered. "No," said Ryder, crouching beside the hole. "That's an Apache snare, old, but clean, tight." He looked up at Silas. "She knows what she's doing." Silas ground his teeth. "Then we stop acting like we're hunting rabbits. Spread out, circle the shack, check the ground, check the trees. Don't assume she ain't watchin'." They split into pairs, boots against sand, rifles low. They weren't laughing now. From a low hill to the east, Nokoma watched through a rusted spyglass. It had once belonged to a cavalry officer. Her husband had taken it off his corpse. She could see their every move. The man with the scars, Ryder, was cautious. The one with the red bandana, Clem, was careless, stepping too heavy, looking in the wrong places. They were snakes in daylight. Easy to spot, easy to bleed. She slid down the ridge, silent as a shadow, and moved toward her second trap. The second trap was older than she was, carved into the land by years of habit. A dried-out animal trail that curved too perfectly around a sharp cluster of rocks. A place she knew they'd cut through. She waited, crouched beneath the brittle arms of a juniper tree. Minutes passed. Then she heard them, two men moving through brush, muttering curses. Clem and Wade. Clem was first, swinging his rifle lazily from side to side. "I don't get it," he grunted. "She's just one woman. She ain't even got a gun." "She's Apache," Wade said. "That's worse than armed." Clem laughed. "She's ancient." Then he stepped into the snare. A thin wire snapped around his ankle and jerked upward with brutal force. Clem screamed as he was yanked off his feet, flipped upside down, and slammed into a low-hanging branch. His rifle clattered to the dirt. Wade spun and raised his weapon, but he froze. Because standing 10 feet in front of him, half hidden in the branches, was Nokoma. She didn't speak. She just stood there, dressed in her shawl, a smear of red clay on her face, a bundle of sage in one hand and a small hatchet in the other. Wade blinked. You ain't armed?" She didn't blink. She threw the bundle of sage. Smoke burst in Wade's face as it hit the ground, blinding him with thick, bitter fumes. He fired once, wild. She was gone before the echo faded. Clem kept screaming. upside down, twisting like a fish. Back at the camp, Silas heard the shot and turned sharply. "Damn it," he hissed. "Another one?" Ryder asked. Silas didn't answer. He just looked toward the horizon. "She's not just trying to scare us," he said. "She's thinning us out." That night, the desert turned cold again. 2 men sat wounded. One was trapped in a pit. Another hung by his foot from a tree. The rest huddled around a dying fire. "Jumpy, quiet." Ryder finally spoke. "This ain't a job no more." Silas didn't look at him. It never was. He stared into the flames. Jaw tight. "She's makin' us look like fools." Ryder rubbed the scar along his cheek. "She's makin' us look dead." Inside her house, Nokoma lit a single candle and placed it beside her husband's knife. 2 feathers lay beside it now. 2 feathers for 2 who fell. 5 left. And the night was just beginning. The desert went silent after sundown. Too silent. No coyotes. No insects. Even the wind had laid itself flat against the sand like it feared to move. The remaining 5 men sat huddled around the fire, each with a rifle close and nerves frayed thin. Billy groaned somewhere deeper in the dark. Leg still bleeding in that pit. Clem had stopped struggling in the tree hours ago. Too dizzy from hanging to speak. The fire crackled. The shadows danced. And something was watching them. "I'm tellin' you," muttered Trent, the youngest of the group, his face pale in the firelight. "She ain't human. I heard stories. Apache witches, skinwalkers. They talk to wolves, turn into smoke." Silas spat. "She's a woman. A dangerous one. But not a ghost." Trent shook his head. "You didn't see her eyes." "Boss, I saw 'em. Like they'd already buried us." Silas looked to Ryder, who said nothing. The scarred man just stared into the dark like he was expecting it to bite back. Then came the howl. Long, deep, too close. The men froze. Another howl answered it, from the opposite direction. Then a third, short and sharp, like a signal. "Wolves." Ryder stood slowly, scanning the shadows. "Wolves don't hunt like that. Not this far south, not this time of year." Another howl. Closer now. The fire popped. Sparks flew into the air. Silas grabbed his revolver. Circle up, eyes out. The men backed against each other, forming a rough star around the fire. Guns pointed toward the brush. But the desert gave them nothing. Only that sound again. Pad, pad, pad. Pause in sand. Circling. Watching. Nokoma moved like fog through the night. Her shawl wrapped tight. Her steps silent. She crouched behind a fallen log, staring at the flickering fire. She had known the wolves would come. They had always come when her husband called. And tonight she had called him. Not with words, but with blood. The scent of fear soaked the air around those men. It clung to them like smoke. The wolves smelled it too. Apache legends say that when an ancestor dies defending the land, part of their spirit returns in the teeth of the wild. Nokoma had never seen it herself. But now, she wasn't so sure. Back at the fire, Miller, the quietest of the 5, broke rank. He turned and ran into the dark, screaming. The wolves were on him before he made it 20 steps. Snarling, tearing, then silence. The others didn't move, didn't breathe. They just listened. The chewing stopped. Then the sound of something dragging across stone. A shape appeared near the edge of the firelight. A wolf, white as bone. Its eyes reflecting gold. It stared straight at Silas. Silas raised his revolver. The wolf didn't move. Then, slowly, it backed away, fading into the dark. The fire collapsed. Only embers now. Trent was shaking. "I'm leavin'," he whispered. Silas grabbed him. "You leave this circle. You're dead." "No, I stay. I'm dead slower." Trent pushed him off and ran toward the horses. He never got there. 1 step. 2. Then a crack. He tripped a snare and slammed face first into a jagged rock Nokoma had placed hours earlier. His neck bent in the wrong direction. No sound. Just stillness. Now there were 3. Silas, Ryder, and Dawes, a heavy-set man who hadn't said a word since sunset. They sat in the dirt, watching the shadows breathe. Ryder whispered, "This ain't just a woman." Silas didn't answer, because somewhere in the dark, Nokoma stood with her bow in hand, watching the men crumble like brittle leaves. 3 down. 4 left. But it wouldn't be long now. The desert smelled like ash and sweat. Morning hadn't come yet, but the fire was gone, reduced to a pile of cold, black bones. The night clung to everything like smoke from a funeral pyre. 3 men remained, and none of them slept. Silas Vane sat with his back to a boulder, eyes raw from the smoke, hand wrapped tight around the grip of his revolver. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. Not since Trent died, not since the wolves left. Ryder sat a few feet away, sharpening his knife, not because he needed it sharp, just to keep his hands moving. His face was stone, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed the tension winding tighter with every passing second. Dawes was sweating. He always sweated, but now it soaked his collar and dripped from his chin. He gripped his shotgun like it was the last solid thing in the world. "Tell me," Dawes finally whispered, "how's she doin' this?" Silas didn't answer. Ryder did. "She ain't fightin' us with bullets. She's fightin' with patience." They'd been trained for men who shoot first and talk later. For barroom brawls and border raids. For mining camps and gang ambushes. But not for this. Not for nothingness. No one had seen her in hours. She moved like a spirit. Attacked like the desert itself, quiet, ruthless, inevitable. Far away, beneath a ridge, Nokoma knelt in the sand, rubbing 2 stones together. Sparks spat into a small bundle of dry brush. She blew gently, coaxing a flame to life. Her hands were slow, steady. This fire wasn't for warmth. It was a message. She set the bundle into a shallow hole and covered it lightly with sticks and dirt. A fuse made from old cloth stretched out from beneath it, soaked in animal fat and dried pine resin. She lit the end and walked away. Back at the camp, Ryder stood suddenly. "Smell that?" Dawes sniffed the air. "Smoke. Where?" Then came the whoosh. A loud crack of fire bursting from beneath the dry brush behind them. Leaping high into the sky, swallowing the edge of the camp in orange and red. The men jumped to their feet, coughing, blinded. Then came the second blast. A pile of small rocks laced with powder Nokoma had hidden beneath the saddlebag of a dead horse. It sent dust and pebbles flying like shrapnel. Dawes took a stone to the temple and dropped like a sack of potatoes. Ryder hit the ground and rolled, coughing, blood on his lip. Silas staggered backward, half blinded, ears ringing. And that's when he saw her. Nokoma, standing at the edge of the firelight. Not running, not hiding, just watching. For a moment, time stopped. The flames painted her like a spirit, shadow and smoke and memory. She raised one arm slowly and pointed, not at Silas, not at Ryder, but at the earth beneath them. Silas looked down too late. The ground cracked, dry wood split, and fire surged from a third trap. A shallow oil pit Nokoma had built from years of burning animal fat, pine sap, and patience. The flames chased toward them like a snake with no skin. Silas dove. Ryder rolled. Dawes didn't move. When the fire died down, only 2 stood. Silas Vane, shaking, coughing, burning with rage, and Ryder, limping, his knife now clenched tighter than ever. The rest? Gone. Burned. Broken. Buried in smoke. Nokoma turned and walked back into the dark without a word. Inside her home, she lit another candle. 4 feathers now. 3 left. The lesson was simple. Never bring fire to the desert unless you're ready to burn. The desert had a way of remembering the dead. You could bury the bones. You could burn the bodies. But the land remembered the blood, the footsteps, the screams. It remembered. And so did Nokoma. The sun crept up slow and angry, painting the sky in deep rust and gold. The fire from the night before had scarred the land, leaving black pits and ash trails curling around the remaining bits of canvas. Blood and broken gear. Buzzards circled low now. They always knew where death lingered. Silas Vane sat with his head between his knees, dry heaving into the sand. His coat was burned at the shoulder, and blood crusted around his left ear. Ryder stood over him, face twisted, jaw tight. "This is a curse," Silas groaned. Ryder didn't answer. He was staring at something in the sand, an old carving in the stone, revealed when the fire scorched the brush away. An Apache symbol, 2 parallel lines crossed with a single diagonal slash. "Do you know what that means?" Ryder asked. Silas shook his head. "It means, you are not welcome here. In the hills, Nokoma gathered stones. Smooth, flat, red stones. The kind her husband had used when building the sweat lodge years ago. She laid them in a circle and placed 7 white bones at the center. Not human, coyote. She whispered her thanks to the animal's spirit and placed her hand over the bones. 3 more trespassers. Husband. She dug her fingers into the dirt. There was no magic in the bones. But there was memory. She remembered where her husband fell. She remembered the sound of the bullet. She remembered the man who pulled the trigger, a man who wore a black hat. Just like Silas Vane. Back at the burned camp, Ryder turned on Silas. "We're not doing this anymore." Silas coughed, wiped his mouth. "What are you talking about? I'm done," Ryder said flatly. "You can go knock on her door yourself." Silas stood shakily. "You wanna run? You go ahead and run. But you won't make it far." Ryder raised an eyebrow. "You think she'll come for me?" "No," Silas said. "I will." By noon, Ryder was gone. Took a horse and rode east. He didn't even make it to the river. Halfway across a narrow ravine, his horse collapsed beneath him, its leg sliced open by a row of sharpened rocks buried just beneath the dirt. Hidden with sand and brush, Ryder tumbled to the ground, dazed. As he stood, groaning, he saw her, Nokoma, perched atop a large stone, bow in hand, notched and drawn. "Stop," he gasped. "I'm done. I'm leaving." She didn't move. "I didn't shoot your husband. That was years ago. That was." Whip. The arrow struck just above his shoulder, pinning his coat to the stone behind him. She could have killed him. She didn't. She stepped down from the rock, slowly, deliberately, and stood in front of him. Ryder's breath caught. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She leaned close and said, calm, cold, "This land forgives nothing." She took his knife, left the man shaking in the dust, and walked away. That night, Silas sat alone. No fire, no light, just a revolver and the sound of his own heartbeat. He watched the moon rise and thought about ghosts. He thought about the man he used to be, and the woman he'd underestimated. Inside her home, Nokoma placed the 6th feather beside the candle. One more, only one, the one in the black hat. The moon was a silver blade, cutting the darkness in half. It hung above the desert like a watchful eye, quiet, cold, unblinking, and beneath it, a single fire burned, but not Nokoma's. This time, it was Silas Vane who built the fire. He sat cross-legged beside it, alone, his revolver across his knees, his hat tossed into the dirt. His coat was gone, his boots were off, just a man now, a man stripped of every follower, every ounce of arrogance, every drop of noise. He was listening. The fire cracked, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky. He spoke. "I know you're watchin'," he said. "I know you ain't far." His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It wasn't cocky. It was low, dry, honest. "I didn't come out here for gold or land. Not really. I came out here to bury something." He picked up a flask, unscrewed the top, and took a long sip before tossing it into the flames. "I killed a man out here. Once. Apache. Long time ago. He wouldn't give up this land." He paused. "I think he was your husband." In the hills, Nokoma stood completely still. Her eyes didn't blink. Her fingers didn't twitch. Just breathing. Just listening. Silas continued. "He wasn't armed. I told myself he was. I told the others I saw a blade. A flash. But he wasn't." He swallowed hard. "I shot him anyway." He rubbed his face, caked in dust and blood. "I saw the look on his face as he fell. It was the same look you have now." Nokoma stepped forward, not hiding, not hunting, walking. She wore a black shawl now, the mourning shawl, woven by her grandmother. A single red stripe ran across the chest, symbol of vengeance fulfilled. Her feet crunched the sand with purpose. Silas looked up. "You gonna finish this?" he asked. She didn't answer. Not yet. She walked straight to the fire and sat across from him. The silence between them was old. Older than blood, older than guilt. He held out the revolver. She looked at it, then at him. Then she reached down, unwrapped a small pouch tied to her ankle, and pulled out a knife, her husband's knife. The blade was chipped, worn, but clean. She placed it on the ground between them. "This is the right of first blood," she said softly. Silas blinked. What's that? It is how we settle debts not paid in time. She replied. You spilled blood, now you offer yours. He nodded slowly. So, you're gonna cut me? No, she said. You will. She pointed at the knife. You must bleed first, not to die, but to be seen. Silas stared at her, unsure if this was ceremony or trap. Then, slowly, he picked up the blade. It felt heavier than a revolver. He dragged the edge across his palm. Blood welled up immediately, dark and thick. He let it fall into the fire. It hissed. Nokoma nodded. She reached into the pouch again and produced a second object. A feather, her husband's. Black-tipped and weathered, she tossed it into the flames. The fire surged high, a final breath before collapse. Then stillness. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she spoke again. My husband does not want your death, she said, but he will not let you leave with empty hands. She stood, walked to a nearby rock, lifted a stone. Beneath it, wrapped in deerskin, was a single gold nugget. Not large, but pure, perfect. She placed it beside him. Take this, she said, and go. Silas stared at it like it was a sin. I don't deserve this. No, she said, but you earned it. She turned, and vanished into the dark. Silas Vane stayed at the fire until morning. When he rose, he didn't take the gold. He took the feather, and left his gun behind. That night, Nokoma lit the last candle. 7 feathers, 7 men, but only 6 had fallen. The 7th had seen, and that was enough. The desert does not celebrate victory. It buries it. The wind had changed again. Softer now, cool, the kind that stirred old dreams and whispered names only the dead remembered. Inside her small adobe home, Nokoma sat cross-legged before the hearth. The room smelled of cedar and ash, of sweat and sage, of old fire and older wounds. Before her were 7 white feathers, laid carefully in a half-circle around a single, unlit candle, 1 feather for each man, 1 story for each set of boots that dared cross into sacred ground. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the match. The last candle. She had lit the first when Billy screamed from the pit. The second when the smoke blinded Wade. The third when Clem dangled from the tree, crying for his mother. The fourth after Dawes fell to flame and shrapnel. The fifth as Trent's neck snapped like dry wood. The sixth when Ryder rode east and never returned. But this one, this 7th, was different. This one was for the one who walked away. She struck the match. It flared bright for a breath, then settled into a quiet glow. The candle's wick caught, and the flame rose, gentle, still, unsure. Like it, too, didn't know how to feel. Was it a flame of forgiveness? Or of farewell? Nokoma closed her eyes. Behind her lids played the memories, her husband's voice as he taught her to carve stone. His laughter as they danced around the fire during the summer moons. His blood in the dust. And then, his whisper in the wind when the first rider came. She pressed her hand to the ground. This land is still ours, she said softly, still guarded, still sacred. Outside, an owl hooted once. A soft wind pushed against the house, making it creak gently like a cradle. She opened her eyes and looked around. There was no victory here. No cheering crowds. No headlines. Just a woman, alone, surrounded by feathers and firelight, holding on to memory. But somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and dry creeks, Silas Vane was walking. He hadn't taken the gold. He had taken the feather. A symbol, a burden, a chance to carry her husband's legacy forward into the world he came from. The world that forgot what it meant to respect the earth. Maybe Silas would tell someone. Maybe not. It didn't matter. The land remembered. Nokoma leaned forward and whispered into the flame. This is the last one. The candle flickered, then steadied. Winter came late that year. Snow dusted the red rock like powdered sugar, clinging to cacti and cracking in the crevices of sunbaked stone. The desert looked cleaner beneath the frost. Quieter, but Nokoma knew better. The silence was never empty. It was earned. 3 months had passed since the firelight. The blood, the screams. The bodies had long been carried away by scavengers and sand. The traps had been disarmed. The ash swept into the wind. Life had returned to its rhythm, slow, dry, and indifferent, but not unchanged, because something new had taken root. On a morning touched with frost, Nokoma stepped outside her home and looked toward the eastern ridge. A patch of green broke the brown monotony of the earth, barely the size of her hand. Wildflowers. Spring. Hidden beneath the snow. She knelt beside them, brushing aside the remaining ice, revealing a cluster of Apache plume, soft white tufts atop red stems. Blooming exactly where her husband had been buried 16 years ago. He is here, she thought, still watching, still strong. She stood and faced the wind. It wasn't sharp today. It carried warmth from the south. Just a trace, like the breath of something forgiven. That afternoon, she walked the land, not as a guard, not as a widow, but as a steward. She fixed a stone fence post near the northern trail. She laid a bowl of water for the coyote that visited at dusk. She whispered thanks into the sky for the clouds gathering overhead. And she found the feather. It was stuck beneath a rock near the edge of the dry creek, where the last campfire had burned. A black feather, worn at the edge, streaked with soot and dirt, but clean. She recognized it. It was hers. The one Silas had taken. He had come back, not to fight, but to return. That night, Nokoma placed the feather above her doorway, tied with deer sinew and a single red bead. Let it be seen by those who passed. Let it be known. This land does not forget, but it does allow peace. Far off, in the town of Lordsburg, a weathered man in a black hat sat in a saloon, drinking nothing, saying little. A single Apache carving hung from his belt, a wolf howling into the sky. When asked where he got it, he only said, "From the woman who owns the wind." Back in the desert, Nokoma sat by her fire, watching the flames. 7 feathers now hung above her hearth. 7 stories, 7 warnings, but also 7 lessons. Not about fear, not about vengeance, but about resilience. About the kind of strength that doesn't shout or strike first, but endures. Like roots beneath dry earth. Like love buried under blood. Like spring beneath the snow.